Hello. To start this story, I want to say I have never seen anything like this in my life. At the time, I was 15 years old, sitting with a friend's dogs while they were out of town in Benson, Arizona. This property had a lot of acres, and it took about 15 minutes to get to their small house, right in the middle of probably about 75 acres. It was around 10 p.m. My friend had 8 dogs, and they usually stayed outside for the most part, because they were big watchdogs who seemed to have been able to defend themselves in the past. Before everything happened, I was inside their tiny home making food when I heard her biggest dog start squealing quietly. Very scared and in pain, but loud enough for me to hear. I knew the sounds were unusual for this dog. I shot up and ran outside to see what was going on. I thought maybe the dog might have hurt himself or something similar, but this was not the case. I ended up seeing a 5-6 foot tall, pale, very skinny creature hunched over this dog, sucking on his head. I was very stunned, almost too stunned to speak, but I managed to shake off that feeling. I started yelling at this thing because the dog started yelping loudly, and I was telling the creature to get out of there and trying to scare it. I ran over to her dog as fast as I could because I'd heard of these things before, perhaps a chupacabra. And I knew they would likely eat the dog if I didn't do something. But I stopped about 10 feet in front of it to see this creature jump up and run as fast as it could away. I couldn't help but keep looking over my shoulder for the rest of the time I was there. I also didn't let those dogs out at night, and I didn't care to go out there either. When my friends came back, I told everyone what happened and what I saw. It felt like everyone was just as frightened as I was, which made me even more unsettled. I ended up leaving that desert and did not look back. Still don't know what to make of it to this day, except I know it was something demonic. I was homeless for a few years from 18 to 21, and I used to stay in a tent with my ex. I always had to end up moving my tent spot, eventually because the cops would find us. Either way, I had spent a lot of time in the woods at night. One night when walking back to my tent, I heard something down the trail a bit. I shined my light in the direction of the sound to be met with glowing eyes reflecting my flashlight. However, where the eyes were made it so whatever I was looking at was taller than me, and I'm 5 feet 8 inches. There is no animal that tall in my area. I turned to my ex and told him to start going to the tent faster. He could tell something was off, so he asked if I was alright. I told him I'll tell him when we get to the tent, because I have always been told not to acknowledge such creatures/spirits as it gives them more power. Then some nights, there would be smacking on our tent. It would hit all the sides of the tent. We would look out the tent windows and check outside the tent, but we would never find anything or hear any footsteps. Another night, during the summer, we decided to go for a small hike at night because it was way more of a tolerable temperature. About 15 minutes into the hike, I started feeling paranoid, like I was being watched. About 5 minutes later, I heard a maniacal laugh coming from somewhere in the woods. I couldn't pinpoint which direction though. My ex asked what was that, and I loudly said, "I don't know, but whatever it is it needs to stop." As soon as I said this, multiple maniacal laughs now started. My ex and I turned around and walked back for what felt like the longest 20 minutes. Another time I found a severed coyote head with something hung in the tree beside it. That had a tooth in it. And lastly, one time I was with my friend parked on the road far into the woods, so we could smoke. The passenger window was down, which is where I was sitting. The woods were right next to me. Again the feeling of being watched overwhelmed me. 2 minutes or so later I heard a hello. And then, John. coming from the woods. I told my friend to turn around and we needed to leave. I didn't tell her why because like I said, I don't like to acknowledge these things until I'm far away from them. That's all that immediately comes to mind at the moment. Thanks for reading. I was talking with my stepmom about late-night driving experiences, and she told me about an encounter she had in Leroy, Montana, on a road trip from Washington to North Dakota. She was on Route 87 and was running low on gas. The Fort Benton exit had a lot of construction going on, and she couldn't see any way to get to the gas stations from the exit ramp, so she got back on the highway. After a while, she saw an exit sign for Leroy, Montana, and it said there was gas and food available. She took the exit and saw another sign reading, Leroy 5 miles. At this point, they had no service and were relying solely on an atlas. The road took them through a dark wooded forest, and after a while, my stepmom realized the odometer had gone up 15 miles, and they still hadn't found any sign of a town. But she kept driving and waited for her friend, who was holding the atlas, to say something. After a few more minutes, her friend spoke up and said she thinks they passed Leroy somehow, and my stepmom agreed. They found a wide shoulder to turn around, and as they were pulling off to make their turnaround, they both had an image flash into their heads. A man standing in the middle of the road. Neither of them actually saw him in real life, but both could describe the man in exact detail. He was tall, with a brown flannel, and what looked to be a scythe, broken in half, with the handle wrapped in a white bloody cloth. He also had a thick scar across his forearm. While that by itself is weird enough, my stepmom planned never to go anywhere near that place again. For the next 8 months, she received frequent phone calls from Leroy, Montana. After my own research, I've come to find out that Leroy is a ghost town unmarked on Google Maps unless you specifically search it up. Some friends and I have already planned to go to Leroy over spring break this year, and see if we can find anything. I'm posting this here to see if anybody else might have seen or heard of anything similar in the area, or have any insight as to what might have happened.
I'm an ice road trucker. Every winter, I drive my semi up the Dalton Highway in Alaska to deliver supplies. Other drivers complain about how isolated the road is, but I love it. Driving through expanses of snow-covered wilderness, surrounded by nothing by the stars. It's the dream. Well, it was the dream until the night of January 17th, 2017. I was driving the stretch between Coldfoot and the Prudhoe Bay oil field around midnight. It's the loneliest part of the highway, 200 plus miles with no gas stations, restaurants, no cell phone reception, no traces of civilization at all. Then my headlights rolled over a truck. It had skid off the road and flipped on its side. From the distance, I couldn't tell if it was fresh or a week-old wreck the recovery crews hadn't picked up yet. "Hey, Jim!" I yelled. He was back in the sleeper. We drove together and took turns, so we didn't have to stop for the night. Besides, it was always safer to have a second person if we run into an emergency. He poked his blonde head out. What? Look, the wreck rapidly approached. It was dark, no headlights, no fire, no lights on in the cabin. Just a metal husk breaking the otherwise monotonous Alaskan landscape. Poor fella, he said, reaching for the cup in the holster. A long slurp echoed from behind. This road gets mighty nasty sometimes. Maybe we should stop. See if they need help. Nah, it's an old wreck. Look how dark it is. Uneasiness settled in my stomach. I'd always felt safe driving up the Dalton Highway because fellow truckers were so helpful. Once, when I'd gotten a flat, no less than three stopped in to make sure I was alright. It was like we were all part of an unspoken brotherhood, looking out for each other. I stomped on the brakes. The truck screeched to a halt.
Hey,
Jim protested.
we're stopping?
Sorry, I need to make sure no one's in there. Leaving the headlight on, I swung the door open and pulled myself down.
Wait, I'm coming.
Jim called after me, pulling on a coat. I didn't wait for him. Instead, I walked ahead, eyes crunching noisily under my boots. The cold wind bit into my exposed face and I grimaced. Hello? I called out into the darkness. No answer. Anyone there? I called again.
See? No one there.
Jim said, coming up behind me.
Stop for nothing.
I ignored him and walked towards the cabin. It was facing away from us, pointed towards the forest in the distance. The trailer was nondescript, no logos or color, but the black hatch was open, rolled up just a few inches. Jim called out behind me.
See? They removed all of the supplies already and left the hatch open. This thing's probably been here for weeks.
Okay, I get it, I called back annoyed. I just want to check out the cabin, alright? Humor me.
Humor you! We're wasting precious time, Donnie.
I ignored him and walked across the frozen plain, my boots crunching loudly through the snow. I rounded the corner and came upon the cabin. I stomped dead in my tracks. It was a mangled mess of metal. The hood was crunched like a tin can. The side view mirror dangled limply. There was no windshield, just a misshapen hole where it used to be. Through it, I could make out the driver's seat. It was horribly buckled and bent, conjuring awful images of what the driver must have looked like. Hello? I called through the window. It looked empty, but just in case. All was silent.
It's empty, huh?
Jim asked, a wild smile on his face. Yeah, and I don't think the driver made it, I replied, my mouth suddenly dry.
The highway, she takes him good. Sometimes. Nothing we can do. Just the circle of life and all that.
Great. Jim was waxing poetic now. "Okay, Jim," I said, cutting him off. "Let's get back on the road." That's when I noticed it. The snow around the truck was undisturbed. No swirl of frantic footprints from the rescue team. No tire tracks from police cars racing to the scene. No grooves from the body being dragged away. The cabin was empty. The driver had most likely perished, and no rescue team had come out. "Why are not there any prints around here?" I asked Jim. "If the rescue team came out..."
Must be weeks old, as I said. It probably snowed 10 times since they got him and the supplies out. Cover the prints right up.
I guess you're right. That did make sense. Now that I took a closer look, there weren't any skid marks in the snow from the truck either. Defeated, I turned and walked back towards our truck.
Wait, what's this?
I turned around. Jim was crouched in the snow, trailing a finger across the ground. "What's what?"
These prints.
I walked back over and crouched beside him. There were several overlapping trails of footprints. They began at the trail's back door, weaved through the snow, and ended somewhere in the darkness of the plains. And they looked fresh. The edges were sharp and clean, not softened by the wind or snowfall. That doesn't make any sense. We're in the middle of nowhere. Not a single soul for miles around.
Then, who made these prints?
I don't know.
Let's find out.
Jim walked over to the back door and with a grunt pulled it open. The metallic sound reverberated through the trailer, echoing against the snow. I pulled a flashlight from my pocket and flicked it on. What the hell? The trailer looked lived in. Empty glass bottles glinted in the light, stacked up in a line against the wall. Clothing was strewn everywhere. In the right corner, they were piled up with a blanket to form a rough bed.
There's nobody for 200 miles, at least.
He said with fascination, pulling himself up into the trailer.
What the heck is going on here?
"Hey, wait," I called after him. "We shouldn't..."
Tools back here, Danny.
He called out, his voice echoing in the metal box.
All kinds of knives and spears and stuff. I suppose that's how he gets his food. Hands it down.
I stepped onto the lip of the trailer and hoisted myself inside. The air was musty, damp, and cold, though warmer than the outside. The floor, which was really the side of the trailer, was tilted in a slight angle. I glanced around. While there were many household items I recognized, knives, shears, clothes, there were some I didn't. A black medallion, emblazoned with a strange symbol next to the bed area. A stone bowl and stick that resembled a mortar and pestle.
Danny, take a look at this.
I turned the flashlight towards him and jumped back. White bone, twisted mouths, sunken eye sockets. More than a dozen animal skulls, all lined up in a neat row at the back wall. The first was tiny, the size of a mouse head. They grew progressively larger, the last ones looking like they belonged to deer, caribou, and moose. And painted on the ground, under our feet, was some sort of symbol. A circle with strange characters all around it. like letters from unknown language.
This is freaking creepy.
Jim said.
Wish I brought my camera.
Despite my thick jacket, a chill went up my spine. Come on, Jim. Let's go. Like you said, we are wasting time. We'll get Broodhole late, and
Oh, now you care about wasting time.
his blue eyes met mine.
You're just a scaredy cat, that's what you.
We both froze. The sound had been faint, but in the absolute silence of this Alaskan wasteland, it was more than just a random sound. More than the wind, the forest, the earth could produce.
You hear that?
Jim whispered. We listened, but there was only silence.
Okay, let's get out of here.
Jim said, taking a step forward. We walked to the front of the trailer, our footsteps shaking the metal. Then we jumped down into the snow. My blood ran cold. A man stood in the darkness, dressed head to toe in black, tattered clothing. A hood veiled his face in shadow, and a knife glinted in his right hand, catching the light of our headlights. We broke into a run. He bolted forward. Crunching footsteps rang out behind us, growing louder by the second. My lungs burned into the cold air, but I forced myself forward. My hand fell on the metal handle of the truck. I dove in. Jim followed me a second later. Click, click, click. He madly pressed the lock button. I turned the key and the engine rumbled underneath us.
Drive!
Jim yelled, panting. My headlights flashed over the man. He stood still in the snow, staring at us with wild blue eyes, gripping the knife tightly. And behind him, more figures materialized around the fallen trailer, all wearing black, hooded clothing. They remained still, their heads turning to stare as we pulled onto the highway. Then they were left in the dust as we sped forward into the Alaskan wilderness. We called the police, but by the time they made it out there, the truck had been cleaned up. It was just an empty old wreck. No animal skulls, no strange symbols, no sign that anyone ever lived there. I haven't driven a truck up the Dalton Highway since that night. I still deliver supplies to other parts of Alaska. Never again will I voluntarily drive up that cursed road. But sometimes, I hear about disappearances along that highway. A lonely trucker, here or there, vanishing into the thin air. His vehicle was left behind, parked on the side of the road. And I know he didn't just get lost on that lonely stretch of highway. He was taken. Not technically a truck driver, but I used to work as a field technician in the oil industry, so I spent a lot of time driving through the remote areas of Canada at odd hours. One very strange and eerie experience sticks with me. I was in either Northeast BC or Northwest Alberta. Can't remember the exact location. Driving late at night when I noticed a very large black shape on the road in front of me. Thinking it was a moose, I stepped on the brakes, coming to a stop only a few feet from it. Despite being so close and having my headlights shining directly on it, I still could not discern what I was looking at. It vaguely resembled a four-legged animal but was unusual large, standing at about 6 feet tall. Apart from its size, it appeared completely featureless. I could not make out any details whatsoever. No shine from its eyes. Nothing. Then I noticed more of them in the ditch on both sides of the road. There were 5 or 6, or perhaps more, all identical to the black shape on the road in front of me. None of them were moving. They didn't resemble physical objects or living things. Rather, they seemed like large patches of absolute darkness. After overcoming my initial shock, a sense of dread began to set in, and I cautiously drove around the creature on the road before quickly speeding off. I don't really believe this was a paranormal experience. I had been driving for 8+ hours through the middle of the night, and I was exhausted. Most likely, it was a hallucination caused by lack of sleep and spending too long staring straight ahead into the dark. Nonetheless, it was an incredible unsettling experience. Not a truck driver, but once I was driving through the Canadian Rockies late at night and had just passed through a small town. So, I'm driving through the pitch black and I needed to stop to pee and have a smoke. But because it's so dark, I missed the last rest stop for the next while. No problem. The highway is completely deserted. So I pull to the next side of the road, have my pee while staring out into the dark, and then light up a cigarette and stand by my car. As I'm standing there, I see the figure of a man just walking out of the tree line. I'm miles from civilization, with patchy cell service, and there isn't a soul on the road. I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me and maybe it was a deer, but nope, it was a man. So I calmly walk back to the driver's door and get in, locking the doors behind me. I'm keeping my eye on this guy as I nervously smoke and have my car in drive, ready to peel out, but for some reason, I just stay put. The guy walks right up to my passenger door and knocks on the window. I crack the window and I ask, "What's up?" He replies to me in a very, very serious tone. "I need you to call the cops." I cautiously ask why, and he tells me he had gone out into the woods to kill himself. But he couldn't go through with it because he had thought of his daughters right before he was about to do it. I called the cops while the guy quietly cries outside. He had a kitchen knife that he was going to use on himself. So I stayed in the car and advised him to maybe leave the knife on the ground before the cops arrived. The cops came and got him, but before they left with him, I gave him a solid heart-to-heart and wished him well. I still think about him. I hope he was able to turn things around.